Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this P2P workshop. We're very excited today to give you the opportunity to attend to 4 presentations that will deal with questions of labor market participation, including questions of newcomers' experiences and the role of gender and language. My name is Luisa Veronis. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Ottawa, and I will be chairing the session today. We will start with the 4 presentations, which will take about 15 to 16 minutes each, back to back. And then we will have a period of approximately 15 minutes for the Q&A. And we would like to ask you to please use the Q&A button that's located somewhere at the bottom or on your right hand on the feedloop screen. So our first presenter for the workshop today is Catherine Scott, and she's a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and she will present findings from a report that she recently prepared on women, work, and COVID-19.
Thanks so much, Luisa, and thanks to everyone for attending. As Luisa said, I'm Catherine Scott, and I'm a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I'm in our national office, which is in Ottawa, located on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territories. I'm really thrilled to be able to participate today and to bring you some updated findings from our research project I've been conducting this past little while, certainly since the pandemic began. The CCPA, I hope some of you may be aware of the work we're doing, is a progressive think tank, has offices across the country. And we have been largely engaged these past 2 years working to look at obviously the evolving impact of the pandemic, and in particular highlighting the impact of the pandemic on those communities that have been disproportionately impacted. A good deal of these efforts are focused on looking at policy and program alternatives that try to address the needs of marginalized workers, which was one of the reasons I was very keen to participate today and to learn and have a conversation about, in particular, the experiences of immigrant women. My project actually zeroes in on women's economic recovery, and in particular, the recovery of marginalized women in hard-hit sectors. And we're looking at that through a series of activities, including the development of a women's recovery dashboard and case studies with hotel workers, immigrant women actually in Halifax, as well as personal support workers, again, focusing in on their particular experiences. And I want to sort of be upfront as a researcher, work in progress. I'm struggling a bit with the framing because, certainly a year ago, in the midst of the second wave, we saw that women's economic recovery was significantly lagging that of men's. But fast forward a year, so, to the end of this, right at the present time, really the talk is now of not so much of recovery, it's all about inflation, rising costs of living, and needs for higher interest rates and the like. And part of that whole conversation, our current conversation, obviously looking at the economy right now, as opposed to the larger challenges Canada's been going through in these last weeks, but looking at the economy, part of the conversation has been about data of on our labor market that as of December 2021, which is when I ran the data up to, that actually Canada had fully recouped from the pandemic losses. And that was true certainly among men and women, and it was actually true among immigrant workers as well. I would argue, and I'll make that point here, is that this current conversation really fails to capture the whole of the picture, and that many women are continuing to struggle economically, and they're caught on the wrong side of the pandemic. So I don't think anyone would be surprised to hear, certainly it's my belief, that the pandemic has certainly ripped away the window dressing to reveal the ways that intersecting gendered sources of discrimination are baked into institutions and public policy. So I hope through this discussion, we'll talk about some of how that's playing out. And so I'm going to focus then on sort of setting a broader context, labor market developments in the last little while, and to flag what that's the experiences of immigrant women, and hopefully to pick up some of the themes that my colleagues will speak about on the panel and further as they do a deep dive into some of the qualitative research that they're doing. So as I said, I'm going to try to share my screen now. Let's hope that it all works out fine. As I said at the beginning, the labor market, as we came to the end of last year, certainly was a good deal better shape than it was at the beginning of the year. Certainly, although January's labor force report certainly recorded all the expected losses that we associated with the introduction of public health measures that were designed to contain the Omicron variant. So as of December, employment certainly among women aged 15 and older had been fully recouped in terms of speaking to their losses as experienced from February 2020. And in fact, employment was roughly 90,000 higher than it had been. And this was led by growth in full-time employment and certainly significant growth among immigrant workers. But it's been a really long road. For immigrant workers, as these charts, here we go, show, immigrant women were really hard hit back in the spring of 2020. While immigrant women make up roughly 1/4 of all female workers, they accounted for over 37% of all the employment losses in the spring that year. You can see that here. I think people can see my arrow. Looking at the scale of the losses, and we're looking at the blue losses capturing that's the employment losses of immigrant women. And that actually doesn't even account for the loss of employment hours that people also experienced at that time. Rates of unemployment were particularly high among Southeast Asian, Black, and Arab women who were working in disproportionate numbers in hard-hit sectors. The initial recovery as well, certainly through 2020, was really slow for immigrant women. And we saw that barriers to their employment situation was particularly high through this period, reducing employment opportunities and access to important social supports on the one hand, and intensifying domestic and caregiving responsibilities on the other. By the spring of 2020, however, the employment situation had started to improve, and we see that with some steady growth through the fall. So the other side of this particular, you can see some of the recovery right here. And what's notable here, and you'll see that with the pink or the red colored bar, is that recovery has been particularly strong among women, immigrant women who've been in Canada less than 10 years. And even among newcomers, even taking into account of the fact that there's, quite significant drop in new immigrants coming into the country in 2020. The recovery among Canadian-born women, however, continues to lag, and that's largely partly response of a large-scale exit of older women aged 55 and older out of the labor market. And so we see that one of the upshots of this has been a narrowing of the employment gap between Canadian-born women and immigrant women, still notable to be sure, but a narrowing through this past year. And we see the same trend actually is evident when we measure the rates of employment between racialized and non-racialized women. And so, the question really for me is whether this improving employment picture has actually translated into greater economic security among women. Because we have other sources of information that actually reveals that levels of economic insecurity remain quite high. Certainly back initially, at the beginning of the pandemic, some of the surveys that StatsCan delivered noted that levels of financial insecurity were particularly high among immigrant families, nearly 3 in 10 as compared to only 2 in 10 Canadians reporting that they were having difficulties meeting their financial obligations. A more recent analysis prepared by my colleagues Sheila Block and Dr. Grace Edward Galabuzzi found that financial security persisted throughout the pandemic. And this chart here is looking at people as compared to Indigenous households, racialized households, and white households. And this is looking at the disproportionate or the disparity. And we see roughly Indigenous people and racialized Canadians were almost twice as likely on average to report financial difficulty as compared to white households. So, we have, I would say, a fluid economic situation with some positive economic news, but persistence and other sources of information suggesting that economic security is more heightened. And I think it's really important to look behind the headline statistics. And there's some really important factors to keep in mind. First and foremost, of course, we continue to see hundreds of thousands of immigrant women working in lower paid occupations and sectors buffeted by the recurring waves of COVID-19. We know as well that these groups have had limited access to needed supports and services as this community sector through the pandemic and still pivoted, scaled back activities and pivoted away from in-person programming. Still others were certainly not even eligible for financial aid at all, and this certainly included migrant workers, international students, and non-documented residents. On top of that, they were not only lacked access to financial support, but in fact, federal and provincial governments failed to put in place really critical support such as paid sick leave, all of which exacerbated the situation of these families. And today's context, of course, we're looking at the rising costs of living, with the knowledge that wages, of course, certainly have not been rising, have been a modest 3% year over year. Yet we're looking at, even last week, reporting out on 5% increase, and higher in certain areas like food, certainly housing, food, childcare, and the like. So I think it's really critical to look at this, I would say, a fluid situation, and to complement the kind of quantitative studies I'm looking at with the qualitative work that my colleagues will be talking about as well. So where are we at this point? And I think that's what we're sort of struggling with right now. I was taken by an analysis by Stephen Lukes recently, who said disasters can be transformative or confirmatory. And I think really that is where we're at right now. Conditions, I think, what might appear to be right for advancing progressive alternatives. I think there's certainly a greater awareness of the gendered impact of the pandemic and the price that immigrant women have paid working on the front lines, in particular, supporting our communities through this crisis. There are growing labor shortages, notably in healthcare, and current transformation of low-wage industries such as hospitality, and that's focusing attention on the working conditions there and dismal levels of pay, and hopefully potentially opening up new opportunities to improve women's economic standing. Certainly the new childcare program being introduced by the federal government, still currently in negotiation with the different provinces and territories, it offers extraordinary potential. It's a huge win, certainly building as it does on decades of research and committed community advocacy. But the jury is still out, certainly, as to whether this will be a real turning point in Canada's care economy, whether actually the promises and the agreements negotiated thus far will actually deliver on a universal program. Certainly, there are other gaps in community services that have gone unaddressed, and I think that's in part reflecting, among other things, a long history of jurisdictional conflict, certainly a history of neglect and rising levels of privatization of social services. We see this markedly in many provinces, including here in Ontario. And I would argue a deep-seated gender bias that's evident through all the pandemic response thus far that assumed that women would just go on with it. And provincial governments in particular that refuse to make any of the necessary investments in the care economy, leaving families to struggle with the not only economic, but the social fallout of the pandemic as well. Losing track. So I think what I fear actually is what we're seeing is that we may be seeing a deepening of the divisions, a confirming, as Lukes would say, of established intersectional disparities in the labor market between low-paid and precarious workers on the one hand, working and a growing number of what's been called triply protected workers, workers who are protected from the pandemic by virtue of their work at home, who are protected in the security of tenure, working in permanent jobs without fear of loss of employment, or working in employment that's not subject to automation. Also a group of workers that not only have prospered through the pandemic, but have seen rising house prices and stock markets benefiting from those increases of wealth as well. So I fear we're seeing a deepening. And the response may well yet be to pull up the bridges, to actually widen the divide. Notwithstanding the improved economic standing of some people in the labor market able to hop over that gap, I think the gap itself, we're not certainly through this. I think at this point it's a real question as to which way we're going to pivot in response to the pandemic. I think just to quickly close and hopefully set up the conversation, I don't think there's any illusion. Certainly gender equality advocates working on the ground, and that's part of our research as well, as looking at what the community sector and what their response is. They certainly believe there's a fight ahead to secure or win the pandemic, as it were. And this will necessarily, probably taking a leaf out of the childcare book, among advocates there, will really hinge on driving transformation by, pushing for strong federal leadership, pushing as well for a willingness to set and enforce measurable national standards. Clearly, significant and sustained financial investments are necessary to affect the types of changes that are necessary to respond to the grievous gaps in our social safety net. And it will take prolonged and broad community advocacy to achieve these particular changes, notably driving those forward for groups of women who are particularly hard hit, including immigrant women. My colleague, Ricardo Tranjan, recently said that, and I thought he sort of captured this clearly, quote, COVID didn't kill neoliberalism. Policy agenda for the future remains fundamentally the same. I certainly believe that, and hopefully through collective efforts like ours and policy alternatives have developed, and within hand-in-hand with community advocacy, we'll be able to push forward to actually meaningfully address the massive gaps that have been revealed and push for a stronger future. So I'll leave it there. There's my contact information if anyone would like to follow up, and I'm happy to chat to you and share my slides and ongoing research. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Catherine. There was already interest in your report, so I put a link, but I'm not sure if you have an updated version so it's in the Q&A. This really sets up well the background and context, and we will now zoom in with Brian Ray's presentation. Brian is my colleague in the Department of Geography at the University of Ottawa, and he will share with us a statistical analysis that he has done on immigrants' labor market participation in the Ottawa-Gatineau region. So, Brian, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Luisa. As Luisa mentioned, what I'm presenting today is part of a report that was produced for the BMRC project, and it's available online. And basically what I'm going to be doing today is giving you some highlights from that report without as much detail as you can find in the report. So the research that we conducted basically is trying to examine some key characteristics of immigrant employment in the Ottawa-Gatineau metropolitan area. And it really is trying to disaggregate the immigrant population, in part because of a considerable amount of dissatisfaction that I have with reports about the immigrant population that talks about immigrants as a complete group, or sometimes talks about them as a cohort in terms of time of arrival. But there's so much analysis that has been done that speaks to differences that women and men have in the labor market, as well as racialized minorities have in the labor market. And so what I've been trying to do in this report is look a little bit more carefully about who the immigrant population is in Ottawa, and to try to look at a little bit more of a complex examination of who people are and what experiences that they have in this labor market. There are some reasons to be particularly interested in the employment characteristics in Ottawa-Gatineau. First of all, Ottawa-Gatineau is perhaps Canada's best example of a post-industrial city. There is almost no manufacturing that occurs here in this region. There's a tiny amount, but it's certainly nothing like you would find in other cities. There is a significant high technology sector here that is subject to boom-bust cycles. And almost all employment is in consumer and business services in this city. So in some ways, if we think about the Canadian economy moving to a post-industrial status, Ottawa may be a very good city to look at to try to examine what happens to immigrants in a post-industrial economy. There are some things here that are also very unique to the region. There are strong limitations on employment in the region's largest employer, which is the federal government. The Public Services Employment Act of 2003 basically dictates that there is hiring preference for Canadian citizens for any externally advertised positions that the federal government might have. This does not mean that permanent residents cannot be employed by the federal government, but there is a preference in hiring for Canadian citizens. They're in some sectors of both the federal government and other parts of the economy. There's an emphasis placed on French-English bilingualism. And to complete the overall picture of Ottawa-Gatineau, this is a city with high median employment earnings, some of the highest in the country, and very high levels of education overall. So things to bear in mind when thinking about this, this city. So the examination, the study, is based on data from the 2016 census that's made available to Canadian universities by Statistics Canada, which means that this study could be done in almost any city across Canada or any university across Canada. And in my analysis, I focus on the immigrant population that's residing in a permanent basis in Canada, so non-permanent residents are excluded. And as much as possible, the analysis focuses on a very particular segment of the labor market. We're looking at people aged 25 to 54 who are working full-time, full year. I could do another complete analysis of the part-time labor force, but because part-time employment changes or full-time employment changes between women and men quite significantly, as well as between different groups that you can look at in the society, I have focused really on a very particular age category, as well as people working full-time, full year, to make sure that you're essentially comparing apples to apples. The report looks at recent immigrants, and by recent immigrants, we're basically looking at people who came to Canada between 2001 and 2016. Depending on the data, sometimes the cutoff date is 2014. And the entire immigrant population and the Canadian-born population is sometimes examined for purposes of comparison. So I'm going to begin by giving you just some very basic overview of people in the Ottawa-Gatineau population. So we're looking at a city of about 1.3 million people, of which about 255,000 were permanent residents. Another 17,000 are non-permanent or temporary residents. Immigrants constitute about 20% of the metropolitan population overall, but the percentage of immigrant residents is higher in the Ontario portion of the census metropolitan area than in the Quebec portion. It's about 11% in Quebec. And non-permanent residents are less than 2% of Ottawa's population and less than 1% of Gatineau's population. In terms of who the immigrants are, the largest component is the economic class, followed by immigrants who are sponsored by family. And you'll see refugees come in as the third largest group, just over 20% in any given year. In terms of the visible minority population, overall, the visible minority population is about 22% of the entire population. If we look at immigrants, though, the visible minority population is in fact the majority of all immigrants. And as you can see in the most recent cohort of immigrants from 2001, visible minorities constitute 80% of immigrants. So you see the shift over time a little bit in the ethno-racial demography of the immigrant population residing in Ottawa-Gatineau. It's very important to emphasize in thinking about the labor market here and immigrants' role in the labor market that immigrants are a highly educated segment of the population. In terms of university level education, the immigrant population far exceeds that of the Canadian-born population in terms of university level education. And you can see that in terms of college education, it is in fact the Canadian-born population that is a larger proportion of people with just a college level of education. And you can also see that relatively few immigrants here come with no certificate, degree, or diploma. All this to say that the immigrant population is highly educated. And as well, in terms of looking at the field of study, immigrants, and especially immigrant-born men, are much more likely to study in the STEM fields, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And that when you look at the Canadian-born population, you see a much larger segment of individuals with no post-secondary certificate training. So important to bear in mind. Women also are much less likely to study in the STEM fields than are men, whether they're immigrants, recent immigrants, or Canadian-born. So having given you this very cursory overview of the immigrant population and some of the characteristics of the labor market in Ottawa, Gatineau, let me turn to, well, what happens to people in the labor market here? So the first thing that's important to stress is the high educational attainment of immigrants. Wait a minute, I'm sorry. There we go, moving forward. The first thing that I wish to stress in terms of people's experiences in the labor market is labor force participation and unemployment rates. Overall, the labor force participation of women in whatever class of immigration you're looking at is lower than for men. Women also tend to have a higher rate of unemployment relative to men in each of these immigrant classes. And there is a significantly higher rate of labor force participation of economic immigrants relative to other groups, and especially relative to refugees. Refugees have the lowest rate of labor force participation and a very high rate of unemployment, a rate of unemployment that is extremely high for women relative to women in other immigration classes, and especially relative to men in other immigration classes. So where are people working? And here it's really important to note differences between the immigrant population and the Canadian-born population. If we look at public administration overall and the subcomponent, which is employment in the federal government, we see the Canadian-born population really predominating in these sectors, in this very important sector of Ottawa's economy. It is quite extraordinary the degree to which the public administration is dominated by Canadians. In contrast, when we look at other industrial sectors in Ottawa's economy, we see a much more significant participation of immigrants in general and recent immigrants in particular. And I draw your attention particularly to the healthcare and social assistance fields, where recent immigrants are very important segment of that labor force, as well as when we look at professional, scientific, and technical services. Again, you see immigrants predominating relative to the Canadian-born population. And also in consumer services, again, you see, especially among recent immigrants, a much more active participation in retail trades and in accommodation and food services relative to the Canadian-born population. And finally, the Canadian-born population, again, predominating in the construction fields in Ottawa, Gatineau. And again, we're only looking at people between the ages of 25 and 54. So what does all this translate into in terms of median employment income? And I'll stress here, I'm only looking at median employment income. I am not looking at other forms of income here, just looking at what people earn as a consequence of their paid labor. Looking at the chart, several things stand out. First, for almost every immigrant class over time, earnings increase with length of time in the country. And you see that especially for economic immigrants, and especially relative to the other immigrant classes, their earnings rise quite quickly. And by the time you get to people who have been here for between 2001 and 2010, the earnings of the economic class match the earnings of the Canadian-born population. In fact, there's about $1,000 difference between them. In contrast, the earnings of refugees rise much less steeply, and they never match the level of earnings of the Canadian-born population or the economic class. And the same is true of the family class, although they do markedly better than the refugee population. So what I've done here in this chart is look at and say, okay, what happens if we control for education and we look and compare women and men? So men are the blue bars, women are the orange lines. And if we see that as the length of time in the country based on education level increases, so do incomes in all the classes. Incomes begin to rise over time, which is not particularly surprising. But you see the earnings of immigrant women consistently lag behind the earnings of immigrant men. And you see that in all the cases as well, the earnings of the immigrant population by education level tend to lag behind those of the Canadian-born population, although the lag is not terribly pronounced for people with a university degree when you compare immigrants who have been in Canada since 1991 for a significant period of time with the Canadian-born population. But again, the earnings differential between women and men, regardless of education level, becomes really significant. If we look at the visible minority population, again, we see significant earnings gaps for the visible minority population in the metropolitan area overall, as well as between the Quebec sector and the Ontario sector. The median earnings of visible minority men lag the earnings of white men by about $20,000. And the gap is consistent if you look at just visible minority men and white men, the gap and white immigrant men, the gap is in the order of $24,000. So visible minority status is a significant component to consider when looking at what happens to individuals in Ottawa's labor market. So you also see significant differences in earnings between visible minority individuals in different visible minority categories. In general, Chinese and South Asian immigrants do remarkably better than do Black and Arab individuals. So the Black population earnings are only about $33,000 a year. For the Arab population, only $30,000 a year. And these earning differentials remain consistent when you look at people by their level of education, for example, by university education, as well as when you just look at people who were trained in STEM fields, you again see Black and Arab individuals trained in STEM disciplines earning significantly less than other visible minority groups in Ottawa, Gatineau. So what can we say about our findings here? First of all, generalizations about immigrants, I think, are highly problematic in terms of their labor force experiences. There's considerable diversity. Overall, immigrants are underrepresented in public administration, which is one of the most important sectors of the economy. And there's a strong overrepresentation of immigrant women, especially recent arrivals in the healthcare industry. So there are differences in industries of employment. There are also important differences in income between visible minority groups, even when considering educational attainment. And finally, and most depressingly, women, almost in every way you can imagine doing the analysis, women lag behind men in employment earnings. And this is true when you consider educational credentials, ethno-racial status, admissions categories. This is one of the study's most consistent and depressing findings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. I'm sorry for the delay. I'm trying to activate my video, but I think I've been blocked, so you only hear my voice. So thank you for those very important findings. and I look forward to the discussion. Our next speaker is Amrita Hari, who is with Gender Studies at Carleton University, and her presentation is with Luciara Nardon, but Luciara couldn't join us today. So Amrita, we look forward. So we're starting now. We have the two qualitative studies that will give us a different perspective on the experiences of newcomers and questions of gender and language. Amrita, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Luisa and Christina, for inviting me to be a part of this workshop. And thank you, Catherine and Brian, for setting up the larger context to which I'm speaking to so beautifully. So the data I'm talking about here is actually part of a larger ongoing study on highly skilled newcomer women's work integration, and also an experimentation with different qualitative research methods. So Luciara and I have actually published already on international students to some extent, as well as immigrant women, highly skilled immigrant women in particular that are affected by the pandemic. And we've also spoken to the use of powerful metaphors as well as reflective interviewing as methods for doing research. So this study kind of builds on that, but provides a bit of a more detailed picture here. So as Catherine and Brian have already talked about, it is well documented that highly skilled immigrants do face a persistent labor market disadvantage. They experience unemployment, underemployment, de-skilling, and downward career mobility upon migration. This disadvantage has been attributed to the non-recognition of foreign education and work experience, perceived linguistic abilities, the loss of social and professional memberships and networks, and as well as racial and gender prejudices, which my two colleagues have already talked about. One of the key features of this evidence that supports these observations is a tendency to construct highly skilled immigrants as a homogeneous category. And this is something my two colleagues that presented earlier have already started to address. So in a similar fashion, we focus our attention on what we consider to be a relatively understudied subset of highly skilled immigrants, and that's immigrant scholars. So we define immigrant scholars as those who possess a doctoral degree and or academic international work experience, but are educated or enculturated in a different system of education than they're currently in or looking to enter. So there's very limited literature on highly skilled immigrants who possess the highest level of education in their field, such as immigrant scholars. But much of this limited literature that's either looked at doctors or often lawyers has found that it mainly looks at their reasons for migration. So that can include adverse political, economic, and social conditions in the countries of origin, high levels of unemployment, high living costs compared to wages in their countries of origin. So we view immigrant scholars struggle to adjust to the professional realities of the receiving country as a type of life transition. And we employed narrative coping to understand how they reconstruct their life stories to offer meaning and consolation when dealing with the traumatic experience of moving to a new country and also facing unemployment. We worked with a local newcomer support organization to identify 5 women with doctoral education who were facing heightened levels of difficulties given their high level of education, their degree of specialization, and unique work experience. So despite their doctoral education and varying levels of international academic experience, all the participants felt that an academic career in Canada was just out of reach. They found often that their fields of specialization were not aligned with the needs and structure of the Canadian academic environment. Their foreign degrees were often discounted despite having achieved the highest level. And furthermore, they were not often competitive as new graduates from North American institutions and educational systems that would be deemed as equivalent. So to grapple with this reality, participants engaged in a process of reconstructing their professional identities in Canada and often exploring different career options. So we found that they adopted 3 primary strategies. First, they had to explain the disruption. Second, they had to seek connections between their skills and experiences bringing in and what was being sought after in the labor market they were entering, and also explore future possibilities. Now, these strategies were not mutually exclusive, and participants' coping was not a linear process. So participants sought to explain the disruption in their career path, often by narrating the circumstances that led them to their current situation. They would reflect on their decisions and faulty assumptions that often they found resulted in an unfavorable employment situation. So it could be things that happened in an interview, for example. It could be their CVs. It would be a variety of things that they would use to explain why it is that they weren't able to find a job in the Canadian academic labor market. They also sought to find connections between their previous careers, their existing expertise, their current professional activities, and what they also perceived as future viable opportunities. So for example, somebody that was trained in biochemical engineering, sought out work as an optician, and actually tried to transfer a lot of their learning about biochemical engineering to lens construction that they found was useful when finding a job in the Canadian labor market. They also explored other professional activities, such as I mentioned, like an optician or a different kind of employment that would build on the skills they already had. And that also meant they were trying different potential versions of their professional selves. So we found that this subset of highly skilled immigrant women actually deal with a very specific manifestation of this well-documented and persistent labor market disadvantage. They had to grapple with what we call the paradox and cope with being simultaneously perceived as underqualified for an academic position, yet overeducated for entry-level non-academic positions in related fields. Of course, these were 5 women with doctoral education, so it's a limited sample, and it didn't allow us to have a more robust and comprehensive investigation of either the strategies that we identified or also differences based on social identities, which my colleagues have obviously done in their previous presentations. But this became something that we wanted to explore further and are continuing to. Regardless of the limited sample, we still felt that there were some important research and policy implications. So it is important that we extended the scholarly discussion on immigrants' life transition when they arrive in the new country, their adjustment and their coping with specific struggles of immigrant scholars themselves. Because of our previous work that looks at the struggle of international students, we found that, of course, there is this push towards the internationalization of education in Canada and elsewhere, and Canada has been struggling for a while to establish itself as a favorable destination for international students. And it's been doing this in various ways. But we found that there's very little of the intersection of looking at the internationalization of education above and beyond international students. So we felt this was a kind of study that could build on the integration of both immigrants that are entering the immigration systems with highly skilled portfolios, but also the internationalization of education at the same time. Lucia and I have been doing work for a long time on newcomer support organizations as well, and there's always been a policy driving force in our research. And what we found, including with the organization that we worked with, is that newcomer support organizations are incredibly critical to providing professional employment support. However, they're typically unprepared and under-resourced to provide individualized support to different highly specialized groups, such as in the case of immigrant scholars. So many of our participants actually talked about the difficulties in rebuilding their professional identities once in Canada, and they also found this to be a very long and arduous process. And for this reason, because a lot of newcomer support organizations are restricted by funding capacities and have to meet short-term employment goals, immigrant scholars can often fall through the cracks of existing support systems that require specialized forms of support. So most of the participants also noted a distinct lack in what they called academic mentorship. So just the kind of information people look for in terms of being able to build new professional relationships in the academic environment in Canada and being able to find a job based on that. And we felt that educational institutions can play a key role in recognizing, incorporating, and formalizing mentorship of international academics as a professional service. Finally, we felt that there's an urgent need for more cross-sectoral collaboration to address the unique integration needs of immigrant scholars. So these could be things such as bridging programs, such as research grants, fellowships, awards, mentorship, in collaboration with newcomer support organizations that are already doing a lot of the groundwork. Similarly, educational institutions and government bodies can allow immigrant scholars to be paid in the forms of these fellowships and awards while they adjust to the new professional requirements of the country. And this could include things such as securing educational equivalencies, allowing for grants and payments to publish in relevant journals and outlets, and also conferences to build these networks. But this would require the consistent efforts of all of these different sectors put together. So very short, very brief, very small study. We're actually in the process of having this published in a journal, and I will make that available to anyone who's interested. And of course, this work would not have been possible without my colleague Luciara and also a very dedicated PhD candidate, Dunya. And this work has also been funded by a Shirk Insight grant. And I'm happy to take any specific questions that anyone has. So short and sweet, Luisa, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Amrita, and I'm very excited because I think our study will build nicely on all the previous presentations, including yours, Amrita. So we'll give right away the floor to Christina. So I will be sharing the slides. Christina will start the presentation, and I will join when my turn arrives.
Okay, thanks, Luisa. As Luisa said, I think our talk nicely complements the previous papers. There are some cross-cutting themes. The title of our presentation here is The Role of Gender and Language in the Ottawa Gatineau Labor Market, English and French-Speaking Newcomers' Experiences and Perspectives. So what we want to do is to present some of the findings of our ongoing project, which examines how recent migrants, that is people who arrived since 2016, enter the labor market and specifically their initial experiences. And I want to draw your attention to the quote from one of our interviewees here. Specifically, I highlighted this because today we're highlighting some of our findings in relation to our respondents' experiences with settlement organizations. So our project has the main objective is to examine the role of language and gender in workers' experiences. And specifically, we are concerned with, I think you can go to the next slide, Luisa. We are concerned with the strategies that skilled workers use to enter the labor market and the challenges they experience. And also the role of civil society organizations, especially in light of the current pandemic. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is firstly, I'm going to briefly present some of the broad context our project is situated in and some of the conceptual frames that have guided our analysis. And following that, Luisa will present some of the project's initial findings. So I want to first turn to the broader context, and that is that in fact, Canadian immigration policy is marked by a range of admission categories, as Brian touched upon, that govern the entry of both permanent and temporary persons. But our project looks at two admission categories, the economic and family class. And in many ways, the selection model that's used to determine who enters within the economic class has been premised on a set of neoliberal rationales, that is the emphasis on human capital characteristics or qualities, and we're familiar with these education qualifications, skills training, communication training, and other kinds of transferable skills. And yet, even with all the fine tuning of that model, the labor outcomes for recent migrants is not that straightforward a story. Not all recent immigrants hit the ground running, and many experience underemployment or unemployment. And obviously that story is further complicated by recent events. And this is the starting point of our qualitative project. We are interested to probe that experience. And the emphasis of the project is to allow participants to speak about their thoughts, their beliefs, and feelings about the strategies they use to access the labor market. So the project is guided by a number of conceptual frames, but I want to draw your attention to two. The first of these is the idea of resilience. And resilience is a contentious term. It's been used by scholars and in public policy discourses in a variety of ways. But generally at the heart of that is this idea of some sort of being able to cope or strength in the face of adversity. And on the one hand, that can seem as quite individualizing, as John Shields outlines, for example, some neoliberal understandings of resilience are dismissive of the role of the state and nonprofit and private institutions and their contributions in overcoming that challenge. And with that in mind, and in this project, we're concerned to use a more expansive concept of resilience, and that is social resilience. And the definition that is here is one outlined by Valerie Preston et al. And this stresses the transformative capacities of individuals and groups and social institutions in dealing with challenges, and simultaneously recognizes how power relations and institutional structures shape those capacities. So very much this definition underscores or emphasizes the ways in which social actors are located in specific social and institutional contexts. It highlights the interrelations between them, and also it's attentive to addressing power relations and institutional inequalities. So in effect, you could think about that men and women in different groups of men and women, as Brian's presentation sort of gestured to, are affected differently by processes of migration and interaction. So in our study, we use social resilience as a frame to consider the strategies that recent immigrants, both men and women in different groups of men and women, have used to enter the labor market. And in particular, we are concerned to illustrate how institutions play a role in that navigation, and flag, let's say, what role the settlement sector takes on. The second concept that we use in this study, and this is certainly the one that has also been noted in the earlier presentations, is we are attentive to the idea of intersectionality, which is an approach developed by the African-American legal scholar Kim Crenshaw, to talk about the need to be attentive to how multiple axes of difference intersect to produce very complex forms of inequality. And this approach prompts us to think about how gender, sexuality, race, ability, status, age, language, and other forms of difference matter in understanding different outcomes. And it really does prompt us to think about how they intersect and how they interact. And for the purposes of this presentation, we've foregrounded gender and language. So the project uses a qualitative methodology. It's part of a larger SSHRC funded project on building resilience in cities. And this particular project is collaborative insofar as we developed it with community partners. We worked out our questionnaire with members of OLIP. And in total, we interviewed 40 people, both men and women, who arrived as permanent residents, either through economic pathways or through the family class. They're employed in different occupations. The project was conceived before COVID-19. We revised the questionnaire to take into account the ongoing pandemic. The analysis of the interviews is currently ongoing, so this is a bit of a preliminary analysis. I'm not going to rehearse the characteristics of the Ottawa Gatineau labor market because I think Brian has done such an able job, but I will turn it over now to Luisa to go over our findings.
Thank you very much, Christina. And so I will briefly provide you with an overview of our participants' profile. One of the main distinctions was that we wanted to integrate both English-speaking as well as French-speaking participants to assess the role of the complex language geographies of the Ottawa-Gatineau region. So for both groups, we have almost equal representation of participants who identify as men and women. The Francophone component is still ongoing in terms of the data collection, and in terms of methodology has been a bit more challenging for us to recruit participants. But for both groups, we have participants who came through the skilled worker or the family reunification class. And we have also a good balance of participants who arrived before the pandemic, so going back 5 years, around 2016, 17, even 18, but some who had arrived a few months before the pandemic or even during the pandemic. So in this particular presentation, we are not doing the comparison, but we will occasionally highlight the impacts of the pandemic context. We had participants from diverse regions of origin across both groups, but in particular, what is interesting with the presentation Amrita just did, many had highly internationalized experiences, both in terms of having been international students as well as professional experiences in various countries. So they were in a way a very cosmopolitan group, and a cluster of them spoke multiple languages, which turned out to be very advantageous in the labor market participation search. So for our results, I will briefly present 3 key themes that emerge from the findings, with a focus more specifically on the use of settlement services. So first, one of our interests was the challenges as well as the strategies they deployed, and we found that most of them combined a number of different strategies, although some subgroups, including based on gender, sometimes also countries of origin, occupations, and language, deployed different strategies. Generally, I will speak more about the settlement services, but they combined these different strategies, and in particular, in light of the pandemic context, the role of social networks emerged as being very significant for them to be able to land a first interview. And once they landed an interview, it was very likely for them to get a job. They combined this with research on the internet and social media, and those who arrived during the pandemic in particular deployed this strategy more than those who arrived before the pandemic. But there is a bit of overlap between settlement services, social networks, and using the internet and social media. For example, some groups have large ethnic communities, like the Brazilians, who are very present on Facebook and WhatsApp. Also, some participants learned with the settlement organizations that they should develop the professional networks and use social media. So these were reinforcing one another. Some relied on opportunities for volunteering. A small number went back to study, but mainly the goal was to build networks, also to acquire Canadian experience by opting for a co-op, a short co-op program, and in some cases for specific professional fields to acquire Canadian credentials, for example, in accounting. And only one person looked or turned to self-employment, but many were interested once they were more established to become entrepreneurs. So we'll talk a little bit more about the use of settlement services. Many said that they found them useful for general advice, particularly on how to prepare their CV in a Canadian format, learn how the interview process was unfolding, to find out about the role of volunteering in gaining Canadian experience, as well as the how to network or how to build networks. They attended for some specific training, workshops, or programs, which I will tell you more about. For some, settlement services were also useful in order to access job listings that are not available otherwise, and to find out about job fairs. And some joined settlement services, particularly to help them develop the network, sometimes even to gain references. So here are some quotes where they say what they learned or how useful these were. We also found that they tended to attend or contact a variety of different organizations, and they use them for different reasons. Now, in particular, one organization emerged as significant, that was World Skills, and a program that World Skills provides, which I will tell you about. But before I get there, I wanted to point out that some participants showed some ambivalence with regard to the usefulness. So in contrast to some of my previous research, where settlement services were very much enjoyed or deemed useful, in this particular group, some participants suggested that they didn't find settlement services useful, or they didn't allow them to land a job. And there were differences, particularly along gender lines. Women seemed to enjoy or think settlement services were more useful than men. But there was also other issues, including the fact that some didn't find out about settlement organizations right away, or not all of them, in part because of the pandemic. So questions of access about information on settlement services is still ongoing. And lastly, an issue was related to the pandemic context, as settlement services had to transition to an online format, and some didn't enjoy, like persons said the online job fairs weren't working for them, they didn't find them useful, or simply there were delays, they weren't hearing back from the organizations.
Excuse me, Luisa, you have 1 minute, sorry.
Yeah. So I will try and wrap up. In particular, some of the participants who were women were part of a pilot program that World Skills launched called Empowering Visible Minority Newcomer Women. And all the women in our sample who participated in this program landed a job and were very happy with the job. So I think here, this program meets some of the characteristics that Amrita was pointing out. It's a 12-week program. It provides hands-on activities with a plan for women to achieve certain goals and standards. They have access to a mentor or a coach, and it's an amazing networking opportunity because they work together. And it turned out this specific program started right before the pandemic and had to switch online in March 2020, and it turned out that the online format worked very well for a lot of the women, particularly those who had small children who couldn't go to daycare or when school was interrupted. So here are some quotes of participants who said that they got positions. They particularly enjoyed the hands-on format of the program, the training and support, the coaching, and the networks they were able to gain. And they identified all of these as being part of the success. They landed a job a few weeks or a couple of months after completing this program. So in terms of our discussion, I wanted to highlight the deployment of multiple strategies, which I think we know, but in light of the pandemic context, I think there is evidence in our findings, something that I would like to probe further about the synergy between the different strategies and how settlement services could tap more, particularly in helping newcomers develop professional networks and teach them how to use social media, for example, among other things. But interestingly, we found that very few of our participants had used pre-arrival services, and many said, if I had known, I could have done a lot of like preparing my CV before coming here. I will stop sharing, and I know there have been quite a few questions in the Q&A button. In particular, there was one from the beginning for Catherine around the cheap fixes that you mentioned in your presentation, if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Thanks, Luisa, and thanks for everyone. I always love going to workshops like this. You learn so much. My reference, and I didn't pick it up in my presentation, to cheap fixes wasn't unfortunately cheap fixes for advancing the employment prospects of immigrant women. It's cheap fixes that the state might well be pursuing at this current moment, which I think are very evident when I talk about we're at a juncture. Certainly in response, in particular to the health, like the pronounced labor shortages and the crisis in the healthcare sector, of course, which disproportionately employs immigrant women, we're seeing already different provinces, for instance, opening up and expanding access to temporary foreign workers. So there's turning to looking for lower cost labor solutions to what is a huge challenge in the care economy. We've seen as well the introduction in Canada in the last number of years for digital gig platforms, particularly in long-term care, platforms such as Staffy or Book Jane, which have been introduced, which bring, it's a variation of the Uber platform. Those sorts of standards where individual workers sign up and are allotted. So without the protection, they are obviously understood as independent contractors, do not enjoy same types of employment rights or expectations, and are connected up with specific institutions, highly individualized, highly problematic form of employment, potentially very exploitative, may well derive some benefits from it, but the proliferation and what has hitherto been in Canada, healthcare sector, largely represented through public employers and the like, it's a challenging development. So we've seen the proliferation of, as I said, gig platforms, and really these types of relationships which undermine the quality of care, conditions of work, and so forth. So those are some of, I believe, like we're at a moment where we're seeing the state pursue cheap fixes as opposed to what is really necessary in terms of investment in our care economy, in the common good, the really importance of nonprofit and public delivery, particularly in sectors like this, which will create a much stronger employment platform. I think this is true for larger services as well. I'm a big proponent on building a strong foundation. So marginalized groups in particular, there's a safety net. Right now, they basically exist over a trap door, which can swing open at any moment, and that kind of precarity. So that's what I was referring to there. And luckily, looking at some of the solutions some of the other folks were talking about, which is great.
Thank you very much. At this point, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. So I was wondering if there were questions from the presenters for each other while we wait and see whether someone else will pose the question. If not, I would have one that, builds on what Catherine just explained about the cheap fixes, but also Brian's presentation, particularly the distribution, the high proportion of newcomers in some of the care industries or the healthcare, and given the current situation. So, Brian, your statistical analysis with data from 2016. So I wonder, given the impact of the pandemic, particularly on immigrant women, whether in fact there's room there either to use some of those healthcare jobs as a cheap fix, or whether this is an opportunity, a window to in fact resolve some of the challenges that foreign trained healthcare workers are facing in this sector.
I think those are really good questions, and and I mean, it's hard to know, right? But what is so striking in Ottawa's economy is, first of all, the number of women who are highly educated, especially among recent immigrants. And you see, I think, a large component of that highly educated workforce in some of the personal services, such as healthcare, and I suspect that will definitely continue. In part because of the absence of opportunities in other sectors. It's so striking to see the predominance of men, whether Canadian-born or immigrant men, working in some of the professional business services, and the absence of women in those sectors. Relative absence of women in those sectors, and the predominance of women in a whole variety of consumer services, especially in the healthcare and social assistance fields. I think that's a big problem in Ottawa's post-industrial economy, is the degree to which those highly paid service sector, business service jobs are being dominated by men, and very little analysis of why and how that happens.
Thank you. And anyone wanting to follow up? Otherwise, just as an anecdote, Brian, we had some of our participants who were from the STEM fields, and in light of the pandemic, they had no problems finding a job right away. Many of them were using internet, social media, and had in fact secured a job offer before coming here. The other thing we found from them is that language didn't matter, because in the technology sector, English is dominant. And so most of them, were able to develop professional networks before coming here, even had landed a job offer. And once they were here, they found very quickly and bypassed, in fact, settlement services. So they were the ones who were ambivalent about settlement sector and said, I don't need that, I can do it on my own. So I think it adds to some of your findings about the STEM fields. There's one more question in the Q&A. I will read it. Why does the government allow the disconnect between immigration and employment? Skilled workers immigrate on the strength of their education, but when they come here, their credentials are not recognized. Is this an accident or by design?
I mean, I think that the question is obviously very complicated, but I think part of the difficulty often with policy and research and lived experience is that they don't necessarily run parallel, that, there are lessons learned at different stages, and similarly, I think policies are implemented at different stages, and there have been various types, including sort of obviously the more the complicated and difficult cheap fixes with unintended consequences, such as the ones Catherine's been talking about. But there have been different attempts, things like occupational lists, things like employer tied permits. Like, they've been different attempts to kind of rectify what I think is a constantly changing problem. I think if the problem is dynamic, it means the solution also just constantly needs to adapt and be dynamic. And I think it kind of aligning those efforts together in a way that achieves success and is just, cause and effect that we can see it so clearly is probably part of the challenge, I think. So it's difficult to kind of answer the question, is it by accident or design? Are there things to the design that can be changed? Probably. That's what all of us here on the panel research and attempt at, but I think some things are obviously accidental, and I think that there's various factors that are occurring at the same time, including individual decisions, organizational decisions, policy that's adopting to something like the pandemic that's ever changing. And I think it's too difficult to just kind of say, if we do this in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, we will see labor market outcomes that rectify all of the longstanding prejudices and all of the existing backlogs and everything. And So that's not quite the answer, but I think it's a complex situation, and it probably requires the kind of ongoing concerted efforts that all of us on this panel are obviously making, including the immigrants themselves that are attempting to navigate a increasingly complicated terrain.
I think, Amrita, you've captured it, but I just maybe add one point and to play devil's advocate. So on the one hand, you know, the state sets up an elaborate architecture of pathways for people to enter, and some of the jobs in which they want to enter are regulated, in fact, by the sectors themselves and not the state. But I think Brian's presentation highlighted a very interesting point in relation to the Ottawa-Gatineau labor market, and that is where the federal government is the employer. There is a structural kind of inequity if you demand that people have citizenship to access, or preferences given to people with citizenship to access certain kinds of jobs. And that might be something that could be probed further, because in that case, the federal government is the employer, right? And it does have the ability to revisit that, or at least consider the ways in which newcomers or recent immigrants access jobs that are, you know, quote unquote, good jobs compared to some of the other kinds of jobs in the labor market.
And with regard to the federal government, there is this special program, I think FIN, which is foreign immigrant training. They get internships of 3 months, I think, with the government. And I've met a number of immigrants who got this opportunity, but then there were no positions to hire them. So they enjoyed it, they developed networks, the job was what they wanted, but it's a 3-month internship, and there was no opportunity, no opening for them. So I don't know the details of each case. Maybe they had to have citizenship or whatnot. But just to say that the government has a program in place and it doesn't seem to be working. Okay, so I think we can close now. The PowerPoint presentations and recording will be available on the P2P website in the coming weeks. I'm not sure exactly how long. And we thank all the participants, I mean, the presenters, but also the audience for joining us today. And we look forward to the publications and outputs from your projects. And thank you again for this highly informative workshop on newcomers and labor market participation.